Hello and welcome to the Psychic Stories podcast, encouraging conversations about mental health. Today I'm speaking to Jamie Clements. Jamie created and hosts the Man Down, the Anti-Man Up movement mental health podcast and works for a fintech firm in London. And Jamie is currently in training to be a breathwork coach. Good afternoon, Jamie.
Hey Matt, how you doing, mate?
Very well. How are you, mate?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. We are just saying before we came on, it's been a busy week, which is no bad thing. There's lots going on, but yeah, no, all good. Thank you.
Good. So now it's time to breathe. Take some space and then basically talk about yourself. So the goal of this episode is to have an open and honest conversation about your mental health journey, to get some insight into the tools and techniques that have helped you and are available and accessible to other people. And by discussing your journey, we hope to share and normalize conversations about mental health, as often people are not alone in these experiences. I hope that sounds good to you.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
Awesome. Right. Over to you. Please tell us about your mental health journey.
Yeah, it's a conversation that, you know, over the course of starting the podcast and everything else that I've been doing has come up more and more. So yeah, something I'm very happy to share, and you know, we can talk a bit later about sort of the power of sharing. But for me, I suppose, in hindsight, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. Looking back, it started for me at about the age of 15. So my parents got divorced quite suddenly and didn't really see it coming. So it was quite a big shock, or a very big shock. I wouldn't want to ever underplay that. And from there, I just sort of, at the age of 15, being such a formative age and such an important stage in growing up and growing into a man, quote unquote, it really just sort of hit me. And I went from being quite a kind of outgoing class clown type to very withdrawn. I didn't ask too many questions around the divorce. I kind of just went into my own world and isolated myself from not only my family, but from, you know, everyone around me. There wasn't any conversation around it. People knew it had happened, but that was about as far as the conversation went. So that was, I suppose, looking back, where it all started. I think at the time, I definitely didn't think like, oh, my mental health is really bad. Yeah. I was just like, God, I feel terrible. And that's about as much as I knew as a 15-year-old. I think the conversation around mental health obviously has come on a long way from then. So there really just wasn't that sort of awareness around mental health. And then
just a second there, just quickly, so at that time, did you notice yourself withdrawing? Was it something that you felt, you say, okay, this is a really bad situation, you know, I have changed as a result of this? Or was it something where you just carried on, you know, pursuing life and just changed?
Yeah, I think more the latter. I think I was just in it. I was just in this world of, you know, pain and despair. And yeah, I don't really think there was even, I'm sure I realized at some point that things were different, but I don't think there was ever any kind of moment where I was like, it came much later that I sort of started addressing it. And I think that sort of awareness came at a much later stage. So I think at that time, like 15 to, you know, arguably 15 to 18, if not a little bit later, I was just very much living it. And still, I think this is the interesting thing about mental health. I was still functioning. Like, I think that's why the people's experiences of mental health is so unique. And I was, you know, looking back, I was very depressed, but I was still functioning. I was still doing okay in school. I was still playing sport. I was still seeing my friends. It was just the way in which I felt internally. And as a result, I think some of those connections with people that were different. So I think that was sort of that early experience. And then that carried on through because I didn't have that awareness of what was going on. It carried on through to university. And university was probably the first time where I kind of had that, not light bulb moment, but realization that this wasn't a normal experience anymore. This was this was a problem, I suppose. So
and from 15 through to 18, 19, when you hit university, you've essentially, those experiences have formed habits, and your habits that you were living every day, you suddenly realize, you say, hold on, this isn't quite right.
Exactly. It was just sort of an acceptance of, and I think probably it went even through even further to that than that. And it was just a case of, I accepted that was just how things were. I think that was, and I think for a lot of people is the toughest part, is because you can't see a way out and you don't actually have an understanding in a lot of cases as to why you're feeling the way you are. You wind up just accepting your circumstances and not really seeing a way out. So yeah, university, so I guess to give a little bit more context around how this came up and how I started to realize things was, as what is quite relatively common, I think, with children of divorce, is that that traumatic event can manifest in abandonment anxiety and issues with feeling secure in yourself and safe as an individual, and so that for me came up really strongly in romantic relationships. So from the age of 15 through till probably still to a certain extent today, issues around abandonment anxiety and feeling like people will leave, and when they do, it being the worst possible outcome, and it really hitting me quite hard. And so that happened at university more strongly than it had happened previously, because I think I was a bit older and the relationships were a little bit more profound and a bit more serious. So when they did inevitably go tits up, because it was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I was so worried about them leaving that I wasn't myself, and you're
behaving in a way that would push people away.
Exactly. So it really was just like that vicious cycle of, I was so scared of it to the point that I made it happen. I created the thing that I was afraid of. So yeah, I just ended up having what I think progressed from being in a place of depression about my parents' divorce and feeling quite isolated and quite alone. I think actually started to get to grips with that, almost like a sort of grieving process, and quite a natural response, I'd say, in a lot of cases, but it did get quite bad, which then the more acute issue for me became the anxiety. And then that anxiety got so severe that I then became depressed because of this debilitating anxiety. So it was a bit of a two-stage process in terms of how that came up for me. But the anxiety just seemed to get more and more severe. And, every time that self-fulfilling prophecy happened, where that vicious cycle took place, it just compounded my belief and that habit that you mentioned, that people do leave. And so it actually just got worse and worse and worse. And that went through university, all the way through till the age of 25. So I'm almost 27 now. So last couple of years, where I was actually able to get a handle on, it was just, like I touched on awareness a couple of times, like that awareness of what was happening, why it was happening, where it came from, and a realization, and this time like an actual light bulb moment, that I don't have to accept these circumstances. Like, this can be something that can change. It's not just, because for me, it was very much a case of, I didn't even know abandonment anxiety was a thing. I just thought these people were treating me in a way that made me anxious. That I put a lot of blame on my partners for, like, I was like, they must be doing something to make me feel like this. And so that kind of realization that actually, no, it was nothing to do with them. Not nothing, but like very much a large part of the issue fell with me. And I think that initially was pretty scary to accept and pretty upsetting, but also eventually quite powerful, because it meant that I actually had control over it, or could have control over it.
And also, I assume then when you have that realization and you're meeting people, let's say you're meeting people again, you're going out, and striking up maybe romantic conversations, relationships, you can then say to yourself in a place that actually I might not be ready for this now. Whereas before, you're going into a romantic, and we all go into these romantic relationships, and if you don't have any self-awareness of where you are in your life, there's that age-old thing where people say, I'm just not ready for a relationship. Well, actually, a lot of the time that has a lot of value and a lot of meaning when someone said that to you. And frankly, often do you want to get into a relationship with someone where someone is going through that process, and maybe you have or you haven't?
Yeah, exactly. And and we can probably touch on it a bit later on, but when I started working through this stuff, educating myself and reading and podcasts and all of these tools that actually help me figure things out. I read a lot about, relationship dynamics, and that was a big thing around realizing that, yes, you can be incredibly compatible as people, but if the dynamic and the attachment styles and the timing isn't right, then it's not going to work. And I think that's what some people, I think unfortunately a lot of people fail to grasp. It's like, but we're so great together. It's like, as individuals, perhaps, but there are a lot of other factors that feed into it that that have to be right. Otherwise there's going to be an imbalance, or there's going to be just friction. So yeah, it's an ongoing learning experience. By no means cracked it. I wish I could, but yeah.
I think can you now you've got that you're a bit more self-aware and working on yourself, you are able to recognize potentially what you've got almost like a fresh pair of glasses on, where you are looking at someone and you can evaluate whether this is a good time or a good person for me to be in a relationship compared to what you were before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that has come down to communication. And I think that for me has been probably the most valuable thing. And I even know to this day, like, not everyone is comfortable with that, and that's absolutely fine. But for me to kind of assess that situation for myself and figure out if it's right for me and if it's right for them, I just have to have that conversation. Like, I don't really like leaving too much mystery to it. It's like, where are you at? Where am I at? Do we want this?
It's much easier, isn't it?
Oh, it's so much easier.
No games.
Yeah, exactly. And I know for my own anxiety that, yeah, things like games and, not knowing where you stand is just not a healthy thing for me. I know that people, some people love playing games. I don't buy into that kind of philosophy, but that's because I have that kind of understanding of what I need and my own, I guess, my own minds. Like, I was chatting to someone for Man Down the other day, and he said he spent the last couple of years getting a PhD in his own mind. And I think that's like, it's a great way to go about it. Like, if you can understand yourself better than anybody else, I think that's a really, really powerful tool to actually like dig into what actually works for you and ask yourself some tough questions and actually start being quite honest with yourself. So yeah, that's, I suppose, the lead up to when things started getting better. So that was sort of how things manifested. And I started at university when I first started realizing and accepting the problem. I started or tried to see therapists at university, didn't have much joy with that, but I think it was a really powerful first step to actually kind of acknowledge that there might be a bit more of an issue there. And then at the end of 2018, had just gotten myself into a new relationship, and this issue of this anxiety just reared its head kind of more than ever before. And like I mentioned, it just kind of, every relationship I went into, it was getting gradually worse because the previous one had compounded that belief. So it got pretty debilitating. I was having daily panic attacks. We actually worked together, and so I was having panic attacks at work, and so it just became so impactful on my day-to-day life that I really had to do something about it. But it was also so bad that I wasn't prepared to do anything about it myself. And it was actually my mum, God bless her, who said, we need to do something here, and will you let me find someone to help you? And I said, whatever,
please, mum.
Yeah, I don't even think I said please. I said, do what you want, I don't care. I was in that kind of place. Like, I was being a real brat. And yeah, lucky enough to start seeing a therapist who got it, who I connected with, and was still with my girlfriend at the time. And actually that for me was really valuable, to actually be able to work through a lot of these issues while I was still with someone. And yeah, we're not together anymore, but yeah, very, very grateful for that experience, and thankful that she was able to help me through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where the journey has come from and got to this day. Sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick one. So you mentioned your mum kind of intervened kind of mid just after university when you were in this relationship. So a couple of things. So you were aware that your anxiety was building up, and it was often when you were in a relationship. But that didn't stop you from getting into relationships. Can you just, from my perspective, just unpack that a little bit? Was it almost a kind of, there was two sides. There was that need to be loved and want to be loved, like we all do. Yeah. But at the same time, recognizing that there's a big danger, there's a cliff ahead of.
Yeah, I think it's actually, weirdly enough, having this exact conversation with my mum yesterday. We're close.
I didn't speak to her, I promise.
Yeah, you haven't spoken to her.
I haven't, I know. Sorry, Mrs. Clements.
She's always doing this. She's getting involved. The last few years, I think, before I kind of really made a lot of progress, I was pretty comfortable on my own, and I actually felt pretty secure. I thought I felt quite secure when I was on my own. So actually, I got to a place of almost thinking or convincing myself that this issue will have just magically disappeared. And it wasn't until I was then with someone that it started to come up. And it wasn't even a case of like every time I was with someone it came up. It just happened to be like a specifically quite intense fast relationship, and that would be what would kind of kick it off. So yeah, a little bit of probably naivety around just thinking that this would go away on its own, and feeling like it had, and then getting myself back into that cycle, because I'm feeling pretty good on my own. Someone, we connect, everything's fine. I'm good again. I'm in inverted commas. So that that I think that's been a big learning as well. It's like, it's good to work on this stuff while I'm with someone, because I'm kind of in the eye of the storm, but also there's a hell of a lot of work that I could be doing on myself to make sure that it doesn't happen when I get into that situation. So yeah.
And mentioning your mum again, and if you don't mind me asking, you don't have to answer. So your mum intervened when you were early 20s.
Yeah.
Did your parents, when the divorce happened, did you feel like they were aware of supporting your mental health? Was when you did change, and I assume as a parent myself, to see your child change from outgoing class clown to withdrawn, must be a very distressing experience. Did you feel personally there was a support for you?
I think so. I think it was, as I said, quite an early time for mental health as a concept, as a conversation. So I don't think my parents, both of them, are fantastic parents. Like the divorce and the effect that it's had is by no means, I would never put that down as their fault. Like them as people, not them as parents, did what they had to do. And that is, for me, I'd rather they'd gotten divorced than spent the rest of their lives together unhappy. And as individuals, they are fantastic parents. So I'm sure they will have. And the reason I'm not saying it with certainty is because my memory around that time is actually not great, because I think trauma can have that impact on how clearly you remember things. But one thing does stand out. I remember it was still when we were living at our family home, so it was fairly early on after the divorce, and I think I was just in a position where I was not able to speak about it, but my mum obviously knew that there was something up. So she said, look, I understand if you don't want to speak about this, but do you want to write me a letter? Like write down what you're thinking. She was clearly an early advocate of journaling.
Honestly, good on her. What an amazing thing to ask.
Yeah. And I think especially as well, given what she was going through, to be able to, I think, I'm sure people can get the impression that we're very close, but she's an incredible woman. So like emotionally aware and emotionally intelligent, that to be able to pick up on that and to offer that as a potential solution or potential way of getting me to speak about this stuff is just genius, given what she was going through at that time as well. So that I remember. So that, I think, probably answers the question. Like the support was there.
Did you write the letter?
I did. I wrote it. I remember leaving it under her pillow or something. And I can't for the life of me remember what came of it, but I think it was just a case of, write it, I'll read it, and we'd never have to speak about it. But it's just kind of knowing that she knew, because there was obviously a lot I wanted to say that I just actually couldn't physically speak. It's not something I've thought about for a very long time, but that was, there was definitely the support there. I don't think that was ever in doubt.
And that silent acknowledgement between you, like in a situation where you might have felt abandoned, by that act, it almost, there's an element it can bring you back closer.
For sure.
So we're in this together.
I am. We've only gotten closer since then, and I'm all for trying to take positives from bad situations. And that for me, then growing up from the age of 15, predominantly in a house with my mum and my sister, has had, endless positives in terms of how close I am with them. And also I say this with a pinch of salt, but my ability to understand women, I think has definitely been impacted by that sometimes. I'm, grateful for the learnings and the closeness that we've got from that.
And these experiences, to be a child of divorce is not, unfortunately, it's not uncommon. It seems like parents of our generation, it seems like that the rate of divorce is relatively high. And I'm not sure how you get, because myself, I'm a child of divorce. Does it make, when you go into or think about a new relationship, do you evaluate it differently? My view was always, I'm wanting to make this work at all costs. I want to get, have a partner in a committed relationship, married, whatever, and divorce will not be an option for me. How do you do that?
I think you're right. I think in my mind, and for other people that I've spoken to about this, I think it can go one of two ways. I think there are the people who are just like, I never want to be in that situation, so I'm just going to be independent, and so strongly and fiercely independent that I'm not going to get hurt like that. I'm probably more on the side of yours, where I am, loyalty and honesty and things like that are non-negotiables for me. And to be, if I'm not so much that I feel I need to be with someone, but when I am with someone, it will be, I think in my mind, cheating is, and being disloyal to someone that you're committed to is one of the worst things that you can do to a person. So
betrayal of trust.
Exactly. It's a massive, trust is not something that should be taken lightly. So I definitely fall on that side. And I think potentially that sort of does manifest slightly in the intensity of some of the relationships that I've gotten myself into, because I meet someone, I'm like, this person's incredible, we connect so well, let's go for it. And that for some people who we've touched on the phrase, like, aren't ready for that, timing or dynamic or whatever it might be, that can scare people off, and then abandonment anxiety goes ding 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 ding, and we're kind of back in old familiar patterns. So it's an interesting one to think about. Is something, as I mentioned, I've kind of read a lot around and tried to educate myself on. But at the end of the day, there's also an element of sort of trusting your gut with this stuff and not overanalyzing it, because that as well isn't particularly healthy. So finding a balance between, knowing what works for you, trying to find that, and then also being able to settle in something and just go with it a little bit as well.
And it seems like where you are now, coming back to the present, that like you are very self-aware as a person, and of course, like you said, you're going through this process. There's always more to learn, to understand. But so from where you are now, you've got a lot of really interesting things going on. It sounds like you've got a lot of good relationships around you, good family, good friends. for you, what work is there left? Like, you know, going inside is a big task. I assume there is a constant process. And from speaking to you before, it sounds like that you perhaps have a plan.
Yeah, I think the work is never done, I think. But I also, as I kind of touched on then with that thing about relationships and being able to go with it, you don't want to get yourself into, I talk about like analysis paralysis, where you are constantly analyzing everything that you're thinking and everything that you're doing, being like, why am I doing that? Why am I doing that? Because that is anxiety inducing in itself. And I think that's part of the process of self-awareness, is that you do kind of get yourself into that point. But as soon as you learn enough, you can then take a step back, and you've got that toolbox and that sort of base level of understanding that you can then use when you need to, and you can actually live your life and just dip into it when you need to. I think in terms of my own journey, and kind of looking forward, a lot of, I suppose, you know, you mentioned I've got a fair bit going on, and that's definitely a relatively new thing for me. And through the progress I made last year, like last year was a massive year of change for me and progress. And I came out of it having really come to terms with a lot of my own struggles. And on top of that, had found a way in which to share that openly and get comfortable with that kind of vulnerability. And with that, all of this kind of facade and sort of disconnection that I'd found from other people and myself kind of disappeared once I was able to openly start talking about what I'd gone through and what I was feeling. And through that, I was able to essentially rediscover who I was authentically. So I was actually able to sort of get through this mist and this fog that I think a lot of people experience, and then realize, what do I actually enjoy? What do I actually care about? What am I passionate about? And as a result, sort of having that weight lifted and that newfound interest and passion for stuff, I was able to go like, shit, I can actually, like, I feel like I can do this stuff now, rather than just, I was always a massive case when I was growing up of having lots of good ideas and never doing any of them. Like, the ideas were there, but I just didn't have sort of the energy or the confidence to follow through with that. And I'm now in a place where, as a lot of people who have struggled with depression and anxiety can probably sympathize with, like, your energy is just not there, and you need that energy to do stuff at a very basic level. So that kind of combination of that energy and that passion for things that I refound through just actually being willing and able to be fully myself, has kind of led to this point where I'm at now. But as I kind of mentioned at the start, there's always more work to be done. So I'd like to think I'm kind of in a next stage of that awareness where it's sort of being proactive rather than reactive. So I'm thinking about how I can be even more self-aware, and how I can understand things that trigger me and why that might be triggering me. And you mentioned right in the intro about training to be a breathwork coach, and the guy that's training me, a guy called Alan Dolan, something he always says is that it's never about what it's about. I think that's very simple but really effective in thinking, like, what am I feeling? What do I think is causing that feeling? And then what's actually causing that feeling? Like, this person is really annoying me. Why are they annoying me? Because they are really arrogant in my perception. But what is that really about? It's because I am really uncomfortable with the concept myself of being arrogant. So that's why I'm projecting that onto them. And that's why I dislike this person. It's actually my own discomfort with arrogance that is making me dislike this arrogant person. And that's been a really big learning. So trying to always think, like, it's never about what it's about. What is this really to do with?
It's also like, it's about that reframing, because I think it's a Buddhist quote. Don't quote me, but it was someone who said, for every person that basically pisses you off, in your head, you say, thank you for teaching me patience. And when I read that, I was just like, that's a really, really, really good point. why get angry? If you reframe it and say, okay, you can unpack that. Why is that person frustrating me? Maybe they're arrogant, etc. But at the same time, one, you could understand why that arrogance affects you particularly. And that is a fascinating insight into yourself. But also at the same time, you can say, hold on, actually, I can use this to build my resilience.
Oh,
And actually, this person is these annoying people, in my perception, are actually really, really useful to me. So actually, carry on being annoying to me.
Yeah, I think that just the whole concept of framing, in terms of framing, your experiences, framing your thoughts, framing your self-talk, like that's been a massive one. Like, what is my my internal dialogue like? And if it's negative, then that's no good. How can you reframe patterns of thinking? Like, it kind of comes back to concepts in CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, how can I reframe this behavior pattern? How can I reframe this trigger, this thought, this feeling? It's really, really powerful.
It's interesting what you were saying, like from where you are now at 27, it sounds like what you've been doing is, in terms of what you've been doing, the relationships, work, interest, friends, whatever, you've been experimenting, you've been prototyping, you've understood what you like and what you don't. And it seems to me now that, every day we encounter a billion different choices. And by understanding who you are, what you like, and having a very clear understanding of that, it makes your kind of process of making choices quite simple. And also a bit narrower as well, which is helpful. So when in a situation where you're saying, okay, there's a new business opportunity which has sprung to mind, actually based on those experiments, you're saying, okay, that idea doesn't tick any of my boxes because I know what those boxes are. Therefore, it's a very easy no from me. Whereas perhaps previously you can get lost in that excitement of, oh God, it's going to be massive and this and that, and
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've said to a couple of people recently, like I really have over the last almost 2 years, kind of treated myself as a bit of a guinea pig, like figuring out what works for me. As I was saying about my podcast guest the other day, Harry Liddell, like getting a PhD in my own mind and figuring out what actually works for me. And that's, I don't take that lightly as well, because I think that's quite a privileged position to be in. And I'm very grateful that I've been able to get myself through the really dark stuff in order to be able to do that. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do that when I was sitting on the floor of my office toilets having a panic attack. Like, that's a very different situation. So I'm not saying this is necessarily a way to get yourself through that, but if you're on that path to becoming more aware of what you are and what you're feeling and your own self-awareness, I think just that, again, framing and saying like, I'm going to try this, and you might actually end up feeling terrible, but being able to then have that outside in view and being like, okay, that's why I'm feeling bad. We'll get through this bad feeling. Tomorrow I'll feel better and we'll find something else. And
you feel better.
Exactly. Yeah. And that experimentation element has definitely been important for me, for sure.
And you bring in those, it's like when you build a house, what you're able to do through those experiments is you're validating your own assumptions about yourself, and you're able to come up with design principles for your life. Like this is the elements of my life which brings me joy and positivity, and therefore this is what I'm going to focus on, because if I project those out throughout time until the day I die, that sounds like it's going to be a pretty positive life. Of course, there's going to be ups and downs. There's loads of uncertainty in the middle of that, but framing it in those foundational terms based on yourself is really powerful.
Absolutely. And I think people talk about sort of your being self and your doing self. And I think that space in between those two, there are things that will happen in between, but if you can always be relatively secure with those sort of principles and foundations in your being self, and whatever's going on around you, being able to have that moment, that space between like a trigger and how you respond to it, that's really powerful. I was reading a book about the principles of yoga really randomly about a year ago, and there's only one, I didn't even finish it, and there was one thing that really stuck with me, and it was about the word responsibility, and it trying to reframe that as the ability to respond, and understanding that you have the ability to respond to triggers, to people, to situations, however you choose. And that for me was so powerful in a place where I was still learning a lot of this stuff, to feel so much less passive to my triggers and to other people, and realize that I could create a bit of breathing space, a bit of thinking space before I became reactive. Because a lot of the time that process is, there's a trigger and you go into this reactive mode where your emotions take over, and before you know it, you're, in my case, having a panic attack. But as soon as I sort of understood that I did have more control over how I responded to things, that was really powerful. And I think with a lot of mental health issues, and from my own experience, anxiety especially, your anxiety doesn't control you. It might feel like it does, but it doesn't have to, I think would be the message that I'd want to get across. It's just learning learning what those triggers are. That's the first step, is identification, but then actually being able to create that space so that you can say, that is my trigger, rather than just feeling the trigger. You're like, oh, there it is. Pause. How do I want to respond to this?
It's that pause, which if you can consciously get that pause in place, it's really interesting. I've never considered the word responsibility as being any way linked to the word response, but of course it is. And actually, that's a really good point. If you can, in this situation, go, pause, what's going on? Is this valid? It's a very powerful tool. It's
really powerful and sounds so much easier than it actually is. I don't want to.
The emotion, the rage is rushing over you.
Exactly. I think, it's learning what those triggers are, so that when they come up, you know that it is a trigger. And by the time you've had that thought that's like, there's my trigger, you've actually created that space, because you've not let it take over, and that emotion hasn't just risen straight up to the surface, and you're not super reactive. So I love that one, just about the ability to respond. It's been really powerful for me.
And it's that as well. You're now visualizing yourself, like you said, when you were 15, you were living in it, whereas now you're stepping away and watching it, and almost objectively, in a very strange way, given that you are your own subjective.
Yeah, exactly.
You able seeing that thing. I suppose in some respects, you talk about negative self-talk. You could talk back if you see something that's a trigger that you're not happy with. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't just say, no, I don't agree with that. Go away.
I think it's one of the it's one of the first things you learn about meditation is around I think Headspace, the guys on Headspace call it noting, but just that act of when you are meditating and you're trying to stay present, and a thought comes in, watching it, seeing it, observing it, acknowledging it without judgment, and letting it go. And that is something that is harder to do when you're active and when you're doing things and just living your life. But the more you practice that, the more you realize that, your thoughts are things. At the end of the day, they are things that occur to you, and you can choose how to interact with them.
So you talk about meditation, and I know you're trained to be a breathwork coach at the moment. You talked earlier about your toolkit. Now, where you are now, I would love to understand what's in your toolkit now, and how has that toolkit been shaped by maybe some other negative experiences that you've had? How have you used that toolkit in those perhaps very difficult situations?
For sure, yeah. It's a great question. I think there are some very common, and I don't like to dismiss them as cliches, because they're common pieces of advice for a reason. The old one around exercise is one that gets thrown out all the time. And there's a reason for that. It's because if you are in a position where you feel like you can exercise, physiologically, that will have benefits to your mental health. It's not really a debate. So that for me has always been a part of, feeling good. But also having a healthy relationship with it, and not kind of beating myself up when I don't. So that's always been one. What else is in the toolkit? I think just kind of energy management is, and I talk, being in the space of breathwork and meditation, there is talk always around energy from more of a spiritual, some people would say kind of woo-woo energy. It's not, I think it kind of devalues a little bit when people talk about it like that. But that kind
It's
of
more
energy,
motivational energy that's not derived from food, but obviously comes from something because it gets us up and doing something.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other end, sort of pure energy that you actually need to function. So you're talking about like real physical energy. And again, it's a self-awareness thing of knowing what takes your energy. You know, this conversation takes a certain amount of energy. We're dialed in, we're talking about, you know, some relatively deep, heavy stuff. So I know that that's going to take my energy. And so if I'm looking at my week, you know, I was telling you this is a particularly busy week, and I've probably bitten off more than my energy can handle. And, you know, for example, I had a dinner booked in tomorrow night that I've just cancelled because up until then I didn't have any evenings free. And that for me is something I know if I want to reserve some of that energy, I need to do. So it feeds into this conversation around self-care and being able to put yourself first when it comes to your own energy tank and your own supply. So knowing what gives you energy, but also knowing what takes that energy away, and being able to think about it. If you want, for a lot of people, it helps to think about it from a very scientific perspective, being like, you have X amount of energy. This, and this are going to take away. This and this are going to add. Therefore, on Thursday, I'm going to feel a bit knackered. So why don't I move that to next week, create some time for myself, do something in that time that helps me and rebuild some of that energy.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
That for me has probably been one of the most powerful things. And I definitely recommend checking out a guy called Chevy Ruff. He came on my podcast quite a while ago now, but he is the expert on this. He talks about it very clearly, very concisely about how things like energy cycles and you know, I always marvel, I don't know if marvel's the right word, admire my flatmate, because he actually does this without knowing any of this stuff, but he works a very intense job, a lot of time in different time zones as well. And he knows what he has to get done in a week, but he will block out at 4 p.m. on a Friday a 2-hour nap, because he knows he then has to work and do, you know, 8 till midnight on a project. So it's that kind of rather than just go and do, actually being able to step back and go, God, this is really gonna wear me out. And if I want to be kind of working or talking or performing at my best, I'm gonna have to shift some of this stuff around to manage my energy. So that's been a big one. And then breath work. I couldn't not.
Yeah. So now talk to us about breath work. So it's something that I'm naive about. I've done a little bit. You very kindly were involved in the Parental Festival live session. So I undertook that breathwork session, which I found, it frankly made me feel very relaxed, which was great. Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, it's something that I'm constantly learning about, and I've been practicing myself for about 2 years now, and it's a really broad term. And I think for me anyway, you'll hear different people talk about it in different ways, but for me, my understanding of it is that it ranges from anything from how we are breathing, so breathing functionally and optimally for our physical health and our mental health, so using as much of our lung capacity as possible, getting that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide optimal. Lots of us have dysfunctional breathing patterns, all the way through to things like breathwork for emotional integration, where you're actually helping people to process things like trauma or emotional blockages in the body. And then in the middle, you've got things like we did at the Parental Festival, just sort of regulatory breathing practices. So using your breath consciously to enact changes in your emotional and mental state. So there's a little bit of a long answer, because there are lots of different facets to it, but at its core, we're all very aware that when if there's a change in your emotional or mental state, so let's say you become anxious, your physiology, your body will then change. So heart rate will go up, palms will sweat, breathing rate will go up. We're all pretty aware of that. What we're less aware of is that our breath can actually work in the other direction. So that's all managed by something called our autonomic nervous system, or some people call it the automatic nervous system, which is responsible for all of the things that happen in your body without you having to consciously think about it. So things like your heart rate that change without you having to do anything. And the breath is the only tool that works in both directions. So if you can consciously control your breathing, you can stimulate responses in your emotional and mental states. So that's why, you know, we've been told for years to breathe deeply when you're anxious, and that is just slow diaphragmatic breathing into your belly that stimulates the, it's a long-winded scientific term, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Bit of a mouthful, but it's referred to a lot as the rest and digest mode, and it's that state that we need to be in to rest and digest and relax.
Can that bring down those stress levels?
Exactly. So that will then actually, if you slow your breathing, everything else can then start to reset and slow down and down regulate. So that then has an impact on the body, and you know, you then get yourself into a much more still state.
Now, you may not know the answer to this question.
Sure.
Is the two-way function, is that evolutionary? I.e., us as organisms can have a stress management system that we can consciously control?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. My guess would be, and I'm pretty sure that animals do this much better than we do because they're not conscious. So their autonomic nervous system actually functions as it should without them having to consciously think about it. The only reason that breathwork has become a thing, I think, is because we've screwed ourselves over, and as conscious thinking beings, we actually think we know better than the body. So the mind sort of takes over and puts us into, you know, we've created cities that by virtue put us into a much more hypervigilant, anxious state. So lots of us live breathing into our upper chest and in the fight and flight part of the nervous system. So your body is always on high alert. So we've created breathwork so that we can actually help people move back into that rest and digest state.
That's fascinating, and it's amazing how you link it to the built environment as well. In that situation, then having an awareness of physically, you know, we talked about life design earlier, where you want to live. How does an urban environment make you feel compared to if you were in a rural or a suburban environment? Actually, you can start to, I suppose, unpack that. And if you, like you said, if you do decide that you are going to live in a city where you are going to be, you know, you are going to be much more, you know, anxious, you know, because of various pressures coming onto you, you've got a tool to be able to say, okay, despite this, I can control it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we've covered a lot of quite complex things within breathwork. If there was one thing for anyone listening that I would advise you to do, it would just be to become aware of how you're breathing throughout the day, because there's two facets to that. You then notice if you're breathing really quickly and breathing really shallow, and you can just take some deeper breaths and help yourself that quickly. And also we talk about creating that, you know, there is the phrase breathing space, but creating that space in your thinking and in your behavior patterns, in that if you're going into a situation that is making you anxious and your first thought is, how am I breathing? You're then actually distracted from the trigger, and you're actually thinking about what's going on in your body rather than all of these sort of intrusive thoughts. And I think that, to come a long way round to the original question, has been incredibly powerful for me, to actually be paying attention to what's going on in my body, trusting that, and then, because of what I've learned, being able to change that, not just becoming aware of it and sort of tweaking it slightly, but actually being able to fully affect that and have more control over what is going on.
And breathwork fundamentally, I assume, forms part of your toolkit as well.
I'd say it's probably the biggest part. Yeah. Sort of breathwork combined with energy management. I think those two are quite linked as well, because it's just a case of using the breath to identify when my energy might be lower, and actually in some cases using breathwork to create more energy, or doing a longer breathwork session to in, you know, tomorrow evening when I've now got some free time, doing it in that part of my day. So yeah, those two I think have probably been the biggest parts for me.
So, and just for the final part of what we're going to talk about, like, can you give us a practical example? So let's say you've received, or I've received, some particularly bad news. Someone calls up and say this has happened, and you can feel yourself go into, wow, you know, shock, whatever it is. From a breathwork perspective, what are the steps? What are the actions?
Yeah, there's a lot of options, but you know, it would be as simple as you know, seated or lying down or wherever's comfortable, just taking one hand and putting it on your belly. You can breathe in and out of the nose, or in the nose and out of the mouth, and it would just be something. It's called cadence breathing, just 4-second inhale through the nose and a 6-second exhale. So a longer exhale than the inhale, and the exhale naturally stimulates that rest and digest state more, and also focusing on breathing down into your belly and into your diaphragm. So I think,
and that's why you have your hand there, so you can feel it go in and out.
It's kind of a physical reminder to breathe into your belly. So that would be kind of just a very simple, like, do that. And not only is the physiology of how you're breathing diminishing that anxiety or whatever you might be feeling, but focusing on your breathing has also taken your mind away from that anxiety as well. So it's kind of a double whammy, like you're actually doing something physically and practically to affect change, but you're also doing something that takes you out of that reactive kind of immediate response state as well.
And it's amazing now, hearing you talking about it, like you can see your eyes light up, you know, in terms of this is something that you deeply, passionately, you know, believe in, and it works, and it works for millions of people. And I think my kind of last comment is, you started with a very sad situation when you were 15. What you've come now is a, you know, you boy to man, a man who's living authentically, a man who understands more about himself every day, seems to enjoy what he's doing and can make good choices from that. That stemmed from those bad situations. And it seems to me the more conversations we have on these podcasts is that there are all these bad situations, and it's how you deal with it and how you progress. And frankly, if we didn't have those bad situations, we would never be able to live. We're not born perfect, authentic beings. We seem to need a push to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was actually having this conversation with someone yesterday, and when you're in that place of struggle and despair, you're never there like thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to learn so much from this. This is going to be a really positive thing. It's the last thing you'd ever think. But looking back, you know, I've mentioned hindsight a few times. Looking back, I'm very grateful for the experiences, because I wouldn't be who I am right now without them. And I actually, speaking of kind of being a guinea pig for myself, I did an RTT, rapid transformational therapy session, which is a brand or a style of hypnotherapy, a couple of weeks ago, just because I've always been curious about it. And I think there's some power in hypnosis in accessing some of your subconscious patterns. Like, I'm very conscious and aware of lots of my issues, but actually some things you need to dig a bit deeper. And one of the most powerful things that the therapist told me, and that I keep coming back to every day since that session, was taking my 15-year-old self to my flat where I live now and showing him everything that I'm doing.
Wow.
And that perspective, honestly, it sounds so simple, but it blew me away. Like, the gratitude I felt, the pride I felt of that difference between that 15-year-old version of me and what I'm doing now, and the fact that I'm still, you know, striving to do more, and that I'm at quite an early stage in this plan, this journey, this progress, whatever you want to call it, yeah, that perspective kind of blew me away a little bit. So I'm super grateful to Grace for that. And that, yeah, I think if people are through their stuff, I think if you're working through your stuff, it's a difficult one to get your head around. But if you're struggling with your relationship with yourself, which I think a lot of people are, just think about, you know, when you're much younger and feeling a bit lost and hopeless, and close your eyes and bring that version of yourself to where you are now, and just show them everything you've done. And I think it can make a big difference for people. I
think having, like, someone told me a long time ago, having a relationship with your earlier self as well, not necessarily, yes, showing them around, seeing how proud you are, what you've achieved, but also looking at them and, putting your hand on their shoulder and say, it's going to be all right.
Yeah, I think it's not something I know a huge amount about, but people talk about reparenting. And I think if you've experienced trauma as a child, there's an element of that sort of self-reparenting where you need to teach yourself or reteach yourself some of the things that your parents may have shown you that you've forgotten, or may never have shown you and taught you. So once you have that kind of perspective, actually, as you rightly said, like having that relationship with your younger self is really, really important, I think. And yeah, that I think has been a bit of a game changer in the last couple of weeks for me, in terms of just how I think about where I'm at now.
Jamie, we have covered a broad range of topics. Thank you so much for speaking about your own journey and story so candidly, but also from your professional perspective as well, and really like understanding the benefits of breathwork and your toolkit as well. So thank you so much for a fascinating, insightful conversation.
Thank you for having me, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. And thank you to everyone listening. You can subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search for Sidekick Community or Sidekick Stories and we'll pop up. Jamie, thank you again.
Thanks, Matt.